Alrighty, I think some folks will continue to join us, but we'll go ahead and get things started this morning. Hello all, thank you for joining the latest installment of our Harvesting Value webinar series, where we'll talk about what happens when the world population maybe begins to shrink and what impacts to food and agriculture that might entail. Our goal with this quarterly series is to provide you with information and resources to help you make important decisions for your operation. My name is Jacob DeBoer. I'm part of the marketing team here at American Ag Credit, and I'm based out of what I call the Great Central Valley of California. Before we dive into our presentation, I'd like to remind everyone of a few housekeeping items. You're welcome to submit questions for our speaker at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature that you'll find at the toolbar of the Zoom taskbar. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. We have time held for that. And we'll also follow up with any questions we may not have time to get to live today. Additionally, this presentation will be recorded and we'll share a link to the webinar to all attendees afterward, and even those who were not able to attend live today. If we've not had the pleasure of working together yet, the American Ag Credit is part of the Farm Credit System, an ag lender that supports all of America's farmers and ranchers with consistent and reliable credit. Our sole mission is to improve the lives of our fellow Americans by sustainably supporting American agriculture, and so everyone has access to nutritious and a sufficient food supply. From small to large operations, we understand the industry and how to structure loan solutions to help our customers achieve their goals, protect their legacies, and grow the industry's next generation. Our presenter today is Dr. Matt Woolf, who is part of the Terrain Research and Analytics team. He's actually a specialty crop analyst focusing on trees, nuts, fruits, and vegetables. He's a native of also the Great Central Valley of California, where his family grows almonds, pistachios, and a variety of row crops. He has experience in economic modeling, macroeconomic analysis, data science techniques, and their applications in agriculture. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen here. Great, so hopefully everyone can see what's on my screen here. Excited to be here to talk about the big shrink. This is something we've been focused on quite a lot at Terrain. In fact, I think about a year ago, we started talking about this as a series when Don Close reached out and said, hey, you ought to really bring some of the insights from your PhD, which was focused on population projections and their impact on the broader macroeconomy, bring those insights to the context of agriculture, because there might be something there. And originally we thought that might be one or maybe two reports, but as we kept on pulling that string, so to speak, it became really clear that it would make more sense as a series. And so it's become a series. We have about 4 published reports out at this stage, and there are more coming along. And so really excited to be here and to talk about this topic. What I'm going to do today is kind of take the reports that we have so far, most of which have been published, but some which we're still working on, and create a narrative here by focusing on these 3 points. First is the historical background. So if you look at the 20th century, the history of agriculture and the history of demographics are very much linked. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'm going to talk about our own population projections as well. Most economists and demographers will focus on the UN's population forecast, and there are good reasons for doing that. I'm going to talk about how we came up with our own population projections. And then I'm going to talk about the impact on agriculture, right? Because that's really why we're all here, is focusing on this third piece where most of this report series is going to live. Now, I'll note too, we have a poll that we created for this session that's going to ask this impact on agriculture of, do you think feed the world is an outdated slogan for agriculture in the 21st century? A lot of what we're talking about today has to do with agricultural demand and how that might change throughout this century. And so we're really interested to get your feedback on that. Again, feed the world is something we hear a lot at agricultural conferences and in the ag media as well. So definitely be sure to provide your insights on that. So starting with the historical background here, most people, I'm sure, have heard of the baby boom. That's when servicemen came back from fighting World War II, not just back to the US, but also back to France and elsewhere in all of the Allied forces, Australia. And so there's a baby boom essentially from 1946 all the way to 1964, when fertility rates really just jumped up in a really big way. And it's only nerdy economists that look at these sorts of things over time, but it's pretty striking what you see in that fertility rate over time. It just jumps up as servicemen were coming back and family formation was really taking off. One thing that I think we sometimes forget about the baby boom is the impact it had on agriculture and economists and academics at the time. There was a lot of concern about the ability of the food system and the agriculture system to keep up with that many more people. And so if you go back to that time, there were writings from very prominent economists and policymakers about this concern. Really famous book is The Population Bomb, which predicted mass famine as early as the 1980s. That book was taken very seriously by many. Someone who appears to have been impacted by that line of thinking in the sort of zeitgeist at the time was Earl Butz, who would eventually become Secretary of Agriculture. And as Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz is very much known for leaning into our productive capacity on the supply side, and then relying and building export markets on the demand side to further move that production. And not only did that mean we did not have the kind of mass famine that many expected we would have, given where agricultural production was going, given where population statistics were going, we had an incredible decline in poverty over that time, and it was also good for agriculture. So US agriculture experienced a 3 times increase in productivity from 1960 to today. Agricultural exports in nominal terms have increased 25-fold. And this idea of feed the world, I think, has really become part of the industry in the last 50 years, right? It's part of what we do in agriculture. If the baby boom was the defining feature, demographic feature of the 20th century, the defining demographic feature of the 21st century is baby bust. We've had fertility rates decline for some time now, not just in the developed world. At one point, it was the case where fertility rates were mostly declining in the developed world. Today, they're declining everywhere, where we have many, many countries below replacement level. So the US is a good example that is well below replacement. China is a good example of a country that's well below replacement. One thing that's occurred as we get closer to a potential population that's going to peak as fertility rates have gone down, is it's become much more challenging to forecast or project what the global population will do and where fertility rates will go. As that peak becomes closer, it becomes much more challenging to do that. And that's part of what inspired us to come up with our own population projections. So I'll talk a little bit about what this second point is getting at. Again, I mentioned most economists, most demographers will rely on the UN's data and even their modeling to come up with our own models. We did that exact thing. We took their data and we took some of the way they model things out and made our own projections. And really, we wanted to understand 2 things. Number one, how sensitive are their population projections to slight changes in the fertility rate? If we increase the fertility rate, if we decrease it, how sensitive is it? That's number one. And then number 2, we also wanted to understand if we just extend the fertility rate outward at its trend decline, what does that do to global population? Where does that leave us? And so this first chart here is showing just that. On the y-axis, it shows the average births per woman throughout a woman's lifetime. So again, this isn't fertility in the biological sense. This is fertility in the economic sense, meaning that the average births a woman will have throughout her lifetime. And what we found is when you just extend the trend outward and assume that fertility rates will continue outward at their downward trend, our projections are much closer to the UN's low variant estimates as opposed to their medium variant estimates, their medium variant estimates being the most likely outcome. And so our conclusion here is that fertility projections as they stand might be a little bit optimistic, right? If we just extend that outwards, and we do include a floor here so they don't just go to zero. But when we do that, it shows that fertility rates going out into the future may be a little bit optimistic according to some of the analysis out there. And I'll note that many other projections have showed something similar here, have done a similar analysis with similar results. Now, one of the consequences of fertility rates going under the UN's expectations, naturally that means that our population forecast at the global level has a lower peak in terms of the level. So the UN's peak is 10.3 billion by the year 2084. Our peak is 9.4 billion in 2065. So that peak is a lower level and occurring sooner than what the UN's projections show. No matter which forecast you think is more accurate, both results are really, really striking. This is the first time in human history that population will be experiencing a sustained decline. If you go back through history, 300 years, there were times when we were jumping up in population, jumping down due to plagues, war, etc. But this is really a completely new dynamic where we are going to be entering a period of sustained population decline. And we think there are likely to be consequences to that, which I'll get to shortly. Not only are these consequences existent in agriculture, but they're also existent in the broader economy. Most economic models, for instance, have a parameter in there that captures population growth. And when you don't have that population growth, you tend to not have as much economic growth. Something that goes along with a population that's expected to peak rather soon and declining fertility rates is a population that is getting older faster. And so this is something you've probably seen in various news outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. These kinds of outlets have covered this a lot more than they used to, given where fertility rates have gone. But I think it's really striking what's happening in the global population, even before we hit that peak population. And I've played around with many different ways of showing this. And I think this is the simplest and most intuitive. So in 2025, there are 6 working age people for every 1 retiree. This has allowed us to develop pension systems. It's allowed economic growth to really thrive as there are more working age people relative to the amount of retirees. In 2050, there will be 4 working age people for every 1 retiree. In 2100, there will be 2 working age people for every 1 retiree. And keep in mind, this is occurring at the global level. So countries that have a more positive demographic story, like many countries in Africa, for instance, many countries in North America, actually, those have better metrics. But if you think about Europe, if you think about China, they actually have worse ratios here. So it's something to consider as we look at this at the global level. Okay, so I'm now going to move to the impact on agriculture, because after all, we're not historians, right? We're not demographers, we're agricultural economists. And so that, again, this is really where most of this report series lies and where we are focused the most on, and really trying to diagnose the potential impact here from aging population and potentially declining population, but also offer solutions for what producers can do going forward. I think the most intuitive thing to think about when we think about a population that's going to enter decline is just what's going to happen to our trading partners. Kind of getting back to that Earl Butz idea, right, of the demand side of the equation, relying on increasing or growing export markets. So this map here shows the estimated year of peak population using the UN's least optimistic estimate going forward, to get an idea of where some of our markets are today and where they might be going forward. So if you look at China, for instance, they have already entered population decline. you look at Europe, they've also entered population decline. Japan has been there for quite some time. But even if you look at some of our other important markets here, Canada and Mexico, they really aren't too far off if we think about how a farm needs to plan for the future. And then our own domestic market is also not too far off. And so I think this is a really intuitive way of looking at what our export market might look like going forward and the implications for trade. A big part of this report series has been focused on trade because we think this is going to be a really important thing for various commodities. Now, it's one thing to look at this from a really, really high level like we're doing right now, but I think it's more useful to look at specific commodities and their potential population risk. And so I'll start here with a lot of the Midwest crops: corn, soybeans, sorghum, wheat, and milled products. If we look at corn and corn products today, about a third are going to countries that have peaked by 2025. If we go to 2035, that increases slightly. If we go to 2050, 81% of corn and corn products will be going to countries that have already peaked. For soy, it's a bit higher. Today, about 58% is going to countries that have peaked. By 2050, that'll be closer to 88%. For sorghum, it's really, really high. A big part of this is China. So it goes from 87 to 92%. That increase isn't as big, but that's quite a high rate to start with. And wheat is pretty similar to corn here. Another kind of sector of the ag economy to consider. I'm out here in California, and we have plenty of almond orchards, walnut orchards, pistachio orchards, and so I thought I'd do a similar analysis for specialty crops. It's a very similar result, trying to estimate the population risk here. So in the early 1990s, almost 0% of almond export value, pistachio export value, pecan, walnut, in total ag export value, almost 0% was going to countries that were in decline. And there's a little bit of volatility there as we get into the late 1990s. Germany, for instance, hit some periods where they were in decline. Other East European countries entered periods where they were in decline. But it starts to go up, and it ticks up quite a bit. In 2009, that's the Japan effect, as Japan entered population decline. And as we get to 2020, it jumps up pretty rapidly there. Again, a big part of that is Europe. A big part of that is China. And if we just extrapolate outwards and assume that each of these commodities are exporting at their 5-year average, and we use the UN's forecast going outward at the country level, we find that it's not so far in the distant future that roughly 90%, 90 to 100% of all of these commodities export value will be going to countries that are experiencing population decline. So I think it's really important to think, what does it mean to be exporting to countries that are experiencing that? What does it mean for those markets? What does it mean for aggregate consumer demand? And again, I mentioned it's not just a population that's going to be shrinking, but it's also the fact that the population is aging. And this in and of itself can have consequences for agriculture and agriculture demand. One of the things that's very clear in the BLS consumer expenditure survey data, but also in USDA survey data, is that younger people tend to spend relatively less on food relative to middle-aged individuals or households relative to older households. So we call this the bell-shaped curve. When you're under 24, you might be a college student, and you might be, not going out to as nice meals, might be much pickier with your grocery bill. You haven't entered that kind of stride of your career. As you get into 35 to 44, or 45 to 54, it jumps up quite a bit. Part of this is having families. Family formation tends to mean higher grocery bills. And then 55 to 64, it jumps down a bit. And then 65 and older, it drops down again as well. And you can see here that this is for cereals, bakery products, dairy products, meats, proteins, fruits and vegetables. This also holds for alcohol consumption. So if you think of something like wine, right? There's been such an emphasis on wine demand recently and how younger generations aren't consuming as much. This is something that holds as well. So I think it's really important to think, what does it mean for more of our consumer base to be living in the 55 to 64, 65 and older category as opposed to 35 to 44? What does that mean when we think about marketing our agricultural products at home and abroad? Now, one thought you may have had as well, of course, older people tend to spend less on agricultural products. They're often living on fixed incomes, which forces them to be a little bit more mindful of what they're spending at the grocery store. So we thought it'd be interesting to look, well, what happens when you look at age, but also categorize it by different levels of income. And what we find is that essentially, no matter what your income level is, according to these 7 or 8 categories here, no matter where you fall in this income distribution, if you are older, you tend to spend less on food spending, right? And again, part of this might be the fact that even if an older person has a higher level of income, they might have a feeling of more economic security. Number 2, they tend to live less active lifestyles. And then number 3, there are changes to the metabolism that will affect food spending overall as well. Now, so far we've talked a lot about kind of diagnosing the problem here, right? Of looking at many of our export markets that are entering population decline, thinking about what will happen as the population ages and what that might do for various commodities. But now I'm going to shift a little bit to what we think makes sense for growers to think about going into the future, given this new reality. And so some of the solutions that we've considered are really fourfold. Number 1 is deepening and broadening export markets strategically. Even though we are entering a period where demographics at the global level might not be in our favor, there are certainly some countries and export markets that have a more positive demographic story or income story as well to tell than others. And so targeting those markets to allow us to continue that Earl Butz mindset of developing the export markets. Number 2, capturing growing demand for high value products. That's another one I'll talk about here in a moment. Number 3, diversifying revenue streams. So thinking of other ways that a farming operation might be able to develop other streams of cash flow. And then 4, developing new domestic demand. I was at the Almond Alliance conference recently, and it was really striking how much of that conversation revolved around developing domestic demand. So on that deepening and broadening export markets strategically, something I just want to point out there is that we've already seen this happen over time. This chart here shows where exports have gone for corn, soybeans, wheat, and sorghum in 1990. So you can see Asia is represented, but Europe is also heavily represented here. And you can see what happens when we get to 2024. Asia is a much bigger piece of the pie. North America is a much bigger piece of the pie. Again, so far, these regions have had more positive economic stories as well as demography stories. But again, that's going to start to change given some of what we've talked about today. On this, capturing the growing demand for high value products, I'm also going to stay on the Midwest crops here. This chart shows corn and corn product exports in 1990 versus 2024. And in 1990, bulk and seed represented the vast majority. But over time, we've started to see value-added products become a bigger share of what's happening in the export market for corn products. So this is really getting at this point of leaning into developing new markets, developing these value-added products that can really help with increased production going forward. And so that's our diagnosis today is I think these population trends as they are, and a population that's expected to peak rather soon is going to have consequences for agriculture. Same with an aging population, but we really do see that there's a really interesting opportunity here as well in terms of being strategic about some of these markets, capturing more of that high value product variety, diversifying revenue streams, and developing new domestic demand at home. And I think it's easy to think that, this stuff is really far away and it's easy to not think about it too much in the moment. But I thought I'd leave you with a quote that I think has kind of been in my head as we've talked about this project and as we've written these articles. In economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will, then they happen faster than you thought they could. And so even though some of these trends might be decades in advance, we think it's pretty important to be thinking about them today. So thank you so much for joining me in this webinar, and I'll pass it on to Jacob.
Thanks, Matt. Super insightful stuff and definitely a lot to ponder. We're going to go ahead and move into our Q&A portion of our session today. We've had a couple great questions come in. We'll start with what I'd say is more of a clarifying question. Going back to your discussion of the effects of some of these population movements on specific commodities, a question came into the end of, you mentioned corn and corn products. Does that extend to include ethanol as well in the corn products?
Correct. Yeah, that includes ethanol, that includes the DDGs, all that good stuff.
Got it. All right, we've started it off with a one-word clear answer, so that's good. As a reminder to everyone, if you would like to submit additional questions, you have the Q&A feature that you can do that with at the bottom of your toolbar. Another question that we had come in, as the population ages, and you touched on this a bit, but maybe share some highlights. Is there more opportunity maybe for some specific crops versus others? Where does the opportunity lie in the cropping mix?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the ways I've been thinking about it is like farming on the long tail of the distribution. I think we're going to see more of a return to more diversification in high value niche markets. And so my expectation is we see that more over time. And then again, I do think there are some commodities that, with particularly that aging bell curve, for instance, that experience that very differently, right? And so what we tend to see, at least in the USDA survey data, is that older individuals tend to consume more, actually will consume more fruits and vegetables relative to what they consume in protein, which they generally will reduce. I also think, not to get too off topic here, but some of the Ozempic type drugs also are something to think about. There's new research out on how those impact different commodities differently. Fruits and vegetables tend to come up as being less affected by those as well. But even talking about fruits and vegetables, there's a lot included in there. So there's still a lot more to unpack within that broader category.
That makes sense. Another question we have is, given some of the shift in population patterns, did you see any new markets export-wise which might be worth exploring?
Yeah, well, we have a recent report that's focused on the nut industry, and the nut industry isn't extremely reliant on exports. We export 70% of tree nuts production in California, so it's a really, really big deal. And so we tend to really focus on where export markets are going, and even get as specific as where population projections and fertility rates are going in various countries. One that's come up quite a bit, and a lot of growers in this area have talked about it, is the possibility of North Africa, for a few reasons. One, Algeria, Libya, a lot of these countries have an actually positive demographic and income story. Algeria, Libya, they have a more positive story in that direction. And we also have a free trade agreement with Morocco. And so when we think about these countries, which are upper middle income, meaning they're about to enter high income status, and we think about those countries being much younger, and the fact that we have a very good relationship with Morocco and a free trade agreement with them. I think there's going to be opportunities there going forward. And then two others I'd mention. We export very, very little to Indonesia and Brazil. These are also upper middle income countries, so they have a very positive income story to tell. They have okay demographics, but they also happen to be some of the largest countries in the world. So given that we don't export a lot there, given that they're developing middle classes, I think it's really something we ought to be thinking about more and more. And I'm aware that my lights went off, but I'm happy you can still see me.
You rolled with it. That means you were in the zone.
I was.
We had another kind of question and comment come in. So it might be either a question of something that have you looked into it? If not, it might be inspiration for things to look in the future. But have you taken a look at like data on price trends of commodities over time and overlaid that or compared that to population data trends?
I haven't, and it's a really challenging. I've thought of doing that. There's a really big challenge there because there's just so many variables at play, right? And so I haven't done that. It might be worth another stab at doing that though, because ultimately what we're saying is there could be some impact there, one way or the other. And so it's really challenging to do. I find it hard enough to connect the almond carryover to almond prices. I mean, you think these relationships should be so obvious and one-to-one. As we know with commodities, commodity prices are just extremely volatile and affected by a whole range of things. So I haven't done that, but I very much understand where that kind of sentiment's coming from.
That makes sense. This might be another one that it might be on your future doc of things to take a look at, but we had a question around India specific, a lot of conversation around the population of India as it bumps back and forth with being the largest in the world. But have you taken a look at where there might be specific commodity opportunity with that country?
Yeah, absolutely. And India comes up a lot because they have better demographics. Again, they don't have the best demographics, but their demographics are better than Europe. They're better than China. And so I think for good reason, India comes up quite a bit. And in our area here, Jacob, we hear a lot about pistachios, and there's been this huge focus on not just pistachios, but also almonds going to India. That's become such an important market. And again, a lot of that's driven by income increases and demography. There are challenges with India. India tends to have a more protectionist history than a place like China. You can see that in India Index that measures that kind of thing. So there is that added challenge there. Number two, if you talk to people who are trying to sell into India, they will tell you that it's very hard to figure out their supply chain and what's going on there. But still, I would very much include India on that list of Brazil, Indonesia, North Africa, India. I would very much, even though I didn't say it before, India, I would very much include there, even with those challenges that might come with it.
That makes sense. We have one more that's come in. We're taking a look at the assumption that the global population will plateau and maybe even peak. But what would need to be true to turn that trend around?
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time working with models that try to understand why fertility rates are declining in the first place. And so I think that's a helpful place to start. Like, why are fertility rates declining in the first place, and why have they been on that trajectory for as long as they have? And there are really two arguments that come to mind. Number one is the opportunity cost of rearing children. So as your income goes up, as an economy develops, there's kind of this added opportunity cost, right? You might choose to spend more time in the workplace. You might decide to take more vacations instead of having that extra kid. That's kind of the opportunity cost side of it that explains some of this. And this is something that we see not just in the US. Again, we see this everywhere. And then the second point is we tend to raise children differently in developed economies than we do elsewhere. So we tend to put a really strong emphasis on goods and services that are extremely expensive, whether that's housing, whether that's education, whether that's healthcare. These are all things that have tended to outpace the CPI. So it's really it's really much more costly given the way we want to raise children today. And so I think the question of whether there will be a reversal has to address those trade-offs, which are pretty well founded in the economics literature as to why fertility rates have declined. I think there's one possibility of what they call fertility rebound, and this is some of what my thesis focused on, where an economy develops so much that that households are wealthy enough where they don't have that trade-off constraining them, and so they can afford to, have 5 kids and take them all to the Bahamas or wherever. And so there is a kind of theoretical economic argument there, and in fact, we do kind of see that in the empirical data a bit, where we now see wealthier families tending to have more children, more educated families tending to have more children. So there is some empirical basis for that. But again, it's it's pretty far out there. Even if we do see an increase in the fertility rate tomorrow, a lot of these effects I think will still be with us because we've gone for so long with fertility rates below replacement. So I know that was a long answer, but I hope that got at what the question was.
I would call it thorough and insightful.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jacob.
We had one more question actually come in the Q&A, and I think it'll serve as a good wrap to our conversation today. But you touched on this at different points in the presentation, but from a producer perspective, these are a lot of things to process, and ultimately it comes down to how does this affect my operation? What are things that I should be looking at now and in the future? So what are some top insights that you would offer that can actually be brought down to the operation level?
Yeah, well, I think this idea of the possibility of returning to diversification in a big way would be really, really important. A lot of this research is pretty high level, right? In terms of it impacting so many markets differently, and I think it's very hard to know how each market will be affected, right? There's a lot within this topic, but I think one thing that makes a lot of sense going forward is diversification, so that if one market is particularly impacted, an operation is able to maintain its viability and stay healthy going forward. And then number 2, I think it's just really important to think about new cash flow streams, and that's kind of tied to the diversification point, but to really get creative about what can be done to make your operation as efficient and successful as possible from that point of view.
Definitely. Well, awesome, Matt. I thank you again for the insightful conversation, and thank our audience for a really good Q&A. It's always good to have that dialogue to really build on the conversation. That's what we have time for today. If you have additional questions for Matt and want to keep that conversation going, he's offered his email. You can email him at mwolf@terrainag.com. With that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jacob.